How y'all doing? So, it's late here, and, I got some stuff keeping me up. Not the least of which is AMD's just absolute malfeasance in their latest announcements of the upcoming Ryzen 4000 series desktop CPU chips. I just can't believe that nobody in a multi-billion-dollar, high-end, industry-leading tech company does not have the wherewithal and the foresight to see what could have been. I just want to lead this off by saying that AMD absolutely had the opportunity to decimate Intel for at least a decade to come. They had that chance in their hand, and they are absolutely, unequivocally just ceding that victory to Intel. They are just gonna keep Intel in the game, and they are not gonna take the knockout punch, or at least they're not willing or able to take the step that keeps them rising up and over Intel, at least in the aftermarket desktop CPU market. Now, granted, that's like a little bit of a niche market compared to, enterprise solutions or whatnot. But these are the facts as I know them. Sometime at the end of this year, AMD is going to release the Ryzen 4000 series of desktop CPUs. Those are going to be CPUs that fit into physically the AM4 socket. There are several generations of motherboards that hold the AM4 socket, starting with the B350 and X370. So that's like your consumer and your prosumer or enthusiast level boards, right? So B350 being a little bit cheaper, a little bit lower end, a little bit lesser bells and whistles, and then the X370, and then there's the B450 and the X470. Same, paradigm, straight mainstream consumer, enthusiast grade hardware, and then for the longest time, once they came out with the new 3000 series chips based on the Zen 2 architecture, the only motherboard choice we had for the newest, for the most bells and whistles you could pile on, in conjunction with the I/O controller die on the new Zen 3000 series chips, was the X570. So the X570 motherboard, along with a AMD Ryzen 3000 series chip, with the exclusion of the 3000 series APUs, because they're always like one half step behind just the straight up desktop chips, got you all the current bells and whistles, right? And what that means is, if you bought a 3000 series chip, but you didn't want to fork out all the money for an X570 board, you could put it on a B450 or X470 board instead. You could put it on a 400 series board. You could take the newest chip and put it on the one generation older board. What's even more compelling is if you were an early adopter and you had a first generation Ryzen chip on a first generation motherboard, but you were an enthusiast level early adopter and you got an X370, or in some limited instances a B350 board that was capable of hosting the newest BIOS updates that allowed you to run the 3000 series chips, you could leapfrog the entire middle generation of Ryzen 2000 series and B450 and X470 boards. If you were an initial adopter, you could go straight, you could upgrade your CPU only straight up to Ryzen 3000 series, as long as, the BIOS supported it. You got BIOS support from your motherboard manufacturer, and your motherboard had the requisite physical VRM support to support the possible, depending on which chip you bought in the 3000 series line, the possible need for more current and voltage capacity in the VRM, right? So it was looking so good. Wow. 3 generations of support and interoperability, right? On the motherboard side, from the 300, 400, and 500 series motherboards, you could mix and match almost at will. It wasn't like a perfect world, but it was way better than anything that Intel offered. Now, I will say that it did require what the AMD AM4 biosphere or ecosphere required from a consumer, as far as like research and making sure that you got a motherboard that either already had the BIOS update, or that you were capable of performing the BIOS update for yourself if you wanted a newer chipset, a newer CPU on an older motherboard. It was like not as clear and cut and dry as some people would lead you to believe the Intel side of things are. But as somebody who has gone from an X370 motherboard and then tried to get a 9th generation R-step CPU to work on an X370 board, I would say that there is just as much confusion and weeping and gnashing of teeth on the Intel side of things as there are on the AMD side of things. I had an NZXT N7 370 board, and I wanted to run a 9700K. Everything on the spec sheet led me to believe that was going to be a drop-in proposition, because I bought my N7 Z370 motherboard well after the R-step CPUs came after. I just assumed it would come to me having had the BIOS flash already done. And in fact, that same motherboard would run an i3 9100F with no BIOS flashes whatsoever. But when I popped in the 9700K, nothing. It absolutely wouldn't even post. And then I had to go back and do a whole bunch of research and figure out that the 9100F and the 9700K, while they are both 9th gen CPUs, it's kind of like AMD and their APUs and their CPUs, right? Their APUs are always a little bit farther behind. So the 9100F is not an R-step. I don't even know what that means, but it's not an R-step CPU. So it'll run on an older BIOS on a 370 board, but the 9700K does not. So that was like a lot of just, trying to figure out what in the heck was going on. And that was on Intel, So there's buyer beware on both sides, right? There's buyer beware. You need to do your own freaking research especially if you're into enthusiast class hardware. The OEMs seem to assume that you will. And to some extent, that's just the nature of the beast. If you're going to build or attempt to build or upgrade components in your computer, it is incumbent upon you to figure out what works with what. Now, it is also incumbent on the manufacturers to be clear and concise in all of their press releases and all of the reading, and not bury it, in page after page, link after link, drill down after drill down. You should be able to get clear and concise guidance pretty easily. That wasn't really the case for the NZXT motherboard, and I don't know if that's just on the NZXT side or what, but I eventually figured out that the problem was that I needed a BIOS update. Yes, the 9100F worked, but it was not the last update that was required for the R-step 9 series Intel chips to work on a Z370. Same kind of paradigm shift on the AMD side. We've been going through a GISA BIOS updates on the AMD side of motherboards for the last, since basically July of last year, when the Ryzen 9 3900X launched on the 7th of July of last year, we've had a rollout, a near constant rollout of new AGISA updates. AGISA is like the source code that AMD controls and holds tight for the BIOSes for all of the Ryzen chips, and they deal that out to their manufacturing partners like MSI, Gigabyte, who's another one? MSI, Gigabyte, ASRock, who make these AM4 socketed motherboards. There's a ROM chip on every motherboard. If you want to look at my, motherboards demystified Sunday Tech Talk from a few months ago, I talk about the ROM chip and the BIOS. So there's a chip on the motherboard that hosts the BIOS. That is the rules, right? The rules of the road for the motherboard. What goes and what doesn't go on that motherboard. So when the new 3000 series launched in July of last year, it required, especially if you were on an older motherboard, an X470, a B450, or what have you, that you update your BIOS in order to support the new chip. And that's all well and good. The problem is that now AMD is using that as an out, in my opinion, a really cheap out for not continuing to support the older motherboards with the newer chips. I just don't think it's true. I have an X470. I have two X370 motherboards and an X470 motherboard over there. They all have 32. I'm gonna get the nomenclature wrong here. I'm pretty sure they're 32 megabyte ROM chips, and the BIOS, the most recent BIOS updates for the X470 is like 16.7 megabytes. So I've got almost half of the ROM chip's capacity not being used. I'm pretty sure there's plenty of space for whatever they have to put like a list. They basically build a list into the AGISA code that says this CPU supported, this CPU supported. It's a whitelist. It's like the old school. If you ever tried to update, like an HP Pavilion computer or whatever, they would have a whitelist of RAM that was supported. They would have a whitelist of GPUs that were supported, and those were all baked into the BIOS of that custom HP motherboard. And you couldn't use anything but what was on the whitelist. And it's kind of like that for CPU support for the AM4 socket. But you can't tell me that there's not enough room on my MSI X470 Gaming Pro Carbon with a 32 megabyte ROM, BIOS ROM, for more processor capacity when the last AGISA code update and BIOS I downloaded barely filled up half the chip. It's just a made-up reason. It's absolutely not true. I don't believe any of the industry when they tell me that, because I've seen the file size. I've seen the mega. There's a really good spreadsheet out there that lists all the EEPROM and ROM sizes on almost every X470, B450 motherboard out there, and there's just no way that that's a legitimate excuse. It's just what AMD's pitching, right? Because there may be some cheaper ones. You can't see it; it's off camera here, but there's a little PC to my right that has a B450 from ASRock, the B450M HDV, and yeah, that's a really low end, very low-end consumer mainstream board, and maybe that has a 16 megabyte ROM on it. I haven't checked that one in particular, but you know what? I wouldn't be heartbroken if that little motherboard couldn't update all the way through Ryzen 4000. But if I buy, a top of the line motherboard and the socket is the same, and AMD tells me that they're going to support the AM4 socket all the way through 2020, I don't expect a bait and switch, and that is exactly what's happening here, right? So the new 4000 chips, the Ryzen 4000 chips, will only be supported on the X570 and B550 chips, and this chipset motherboards. And this is what really burns me up about this, is that the B550 motherboards have been promised to come out for almost a year, and they've been pushed back, and pushed back, and people who wanted to build a budget system and didn't want to invest a ton of money in an X570 board, they just wanted a Ryzen 5 3600, which is a mainstream. It's kind of like straddles that mainstream versus enthusiast price point there. They had a choice between spending like $150 to $170 or to $1,000 on an X570 board, or they could spend like $100 or less on a B450 board and get pretty much the same performance, with the understanding that they would have the option to upgrade to a 4000 series later on. That was at least what we thought. And now what we found out is, because there was never a 500 series, or there wasn't a 500 series budget consumer motherboard option for over a year, that everybody who went through that scenario has just lost their entire upgrade path. They're not going to be able to get a Ryzen 5 4600 onto their B450 because AMD's just pulled the rug out from under everybody. And what kills me about this whole scenario is if that AMD would just grab, just freaking grab their panties, unbunch them, and release the freaking hounds, they could crush the CPU and motherboard market from end to end, from the low-end consumer market to the high-end. They could absolutely put a stranglehold on Intel if they would just unleash the demons, right? Let us put whatever AM4 CPU we want on any AM4 socketed motherboard we want. Or at least let the motherboard manufacturers, the people who are like most in tune with what each individual motherboard should support, let them decide, right? And if you pulled the trigger and you went with MSI and they have shitty, support, and they don't, update their codes, or they don't update their BIOS, or they don't have the manpower or whatever to put it in there, but ASRock does, or Gigabyte does, or whoever it is does, that's on that individual company. It's not a central planning, communist style decision from AMD. AMD should just let the dogs run wild and let the motherboard manufacturers figure it out which one of their X470s and B450s has the wherewithal to just absolutely, punch above its weight, and they can carry a Ryzen 4000 series chipset forward. They have the capacity in the EEPROM and in the ROM chip to hold the bigger BIOS. They have the VRM to support, bigger power requirements if that's a necessity. All of that kind of stuff. Now, what AMD could limit, and what I would totally understand it, is if they said, yeah, absolutely, you can put that 4000 series Ryzen chip on your, X370 high-end motherboard from a couple of years ago. That's fine, but you're not going to get support for PCI Gen 4. And you're not going to get support for, as many PCIe lanes as the new CPU may support. You're going to be hamstrung on these on some of the niceties. Maybe they're going to cut back on, gigabit LAN that's integrated into. I don't know if the new 600 series chipset will have gigabit LAN or whatever. I'm assuming there will be an X670 motherboard that comes out with the Ryzen 4000 series chips. So maybe there will be, a striation in the bells and whistles that you can get, but at least you should be able to get a functioning computer, right? You should have enough PCIe lanes, Gen 3 or Gen 4 or whatever, for graphics. If you got an X470, you should be able to use, SLI or Crossfire, if that's your thing. I don't recommend it, but if that's your thing and you want to do it, you got reasons, your reasons are your own. You should be able to do it. And that's what I think. I'm just kind of flabbergasted that AMD doesn't see, what they're capable of doing right now. That's what's really blowing my mind, is they're hamstringing themselves. They are like intentionally constraining themselves. If they just let this beast out, if they let Ryzen 1000 through 4000 series out of the cage, right, and let it just ride on whatever motherboard the motherboard manufacturers deemed appropriate based on legit science and specifications, right? And it would blow the doors off of Intel. Intel would take at least a decade to recover from that, because they are stuck on this tick-tock mechanism, right? If you're an early adopter on a new platform, you're supposed to get 2 years out of it. But guess what? Intel's not even going to do that. This new Z490 is going to be on the LGA 1200 socket, and then 1 year later, they're going to move to a new LGA socket. They've already said it. The press releases are out. They're even worse than AMD is right now. Intel's even worse. The LGA 1200 socket on the Z490 motherboards is only going to last 1 generation. AMD would bring so many people into the fold if they would just unleash the capacity for the interoperability of the AM4 socket. And I cannot believe, it boggles my mind that there is a company that is so short-sighted. It doesn't understand the market. I just made a video a couple months ago about AMD understanding the market because they were, releasing the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X, and they understood that that consumers needed those chips or wanted those chips. That price point and that performance there was a vacuum there. And I cannot believe that the people who would release the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X would constrain people who bought a B4, who were like, the B550 is not out yet. I want this 3300X. I got a B450. I'm going to put that 3300X on a B450. They don't want those people to buy 4000 series chips. Like, if I have a 3300X on a B450 motherboard, does Ryzen not want me to buy a Ryzen 5 4600 as my upgrade? New. Because if they do what they're doing right now, my only option for an upgrade is a Ryzen 5 3600. And by the time I get around to upgrading, it's going to be used, which means AMD is going to get no residual sales off that. They don't get a royalty every time a used Ryzen sells, right? Yeah, my next upgrade path is either a Ryzen 5 3600 or maybe a Ryzen 7 3700X or a 3800X. But those will all be used by the time I get around to it. If I put a 3300X on a B450 and I'm a budget-oriented consumer, right? I am scrounging, especially nowadays. We got so many people who are unemployed and Voldemort and human malware and all that kind of stuff going around right here. It's not a time to be telling folks that the socket you thought was going to go for 4 generations is now only going to go for 3, and be pulling the rug out from under people. This is not the time to do that. They need to find a way. There is a way. I'm positive there's a way. It may be a selective way. It may be a branch tree way. It may say, hey, look, if you are on a B450 motherboard and you update to this BIOS, then your B450 motherboard will now no longer support 1000 series chips. You're going to trade your 1000 series chip support for 4000 series chip support. And as long as you're clear and concise in the guidance, as long as the motherboard manufacturers put that on their BIOS update pages, look, if you are using one of these series of chips, if you're using a Ryzen 5 or 3, 5, or 7, 1200, 1300X, 1400, 1500X, 1600, all of it. If you list all that out, you list every single first gen Ryzen chip, is if you're using one of these and you download and update this BIOS, this chip will no longer work, right? You just have to let people know that there's like it's a bridge of no return type transaction. The majority of us are smart enough to figure that out, right? And if we're not, we hopefully will go ask somebody what the right answer is. But this whole just a hard stop and saying, hey, if you're on a 400 series chipset, I feel sorry for you. I know we didn't release B550 for like a year after the 3000 series, but don't hate the player, hate the game type scenario. Just absolutely smacks of like everything that AMD has ever pointed the fingers at Intel of doing. That is AMD is exactly doing the things that they've like in their marketing and in their literature. They've made sly, offhanded comments about the way Intel handles their chipset longevity, and this is exactly the same scenario. Almost the same scenario. If B550 had launched the day that the Ryzen 3000 series chipset had launched, I wouldn't be having this conversation. If we'd had B550 chipsets motherboards for a year and AMD was like, hey, it's just getting to where the technical juice isn't worth the squeeze on this. We're gonna cut it. You guys have had plenty of time. All the new adopters, the budget adopters on the Ryzen 3000 chips, that got the B550 boards, they're going to be able to move forward with the 4000 series chips. It's going to be fine. I would not be as angry. I would not be as just disappointed as I am right now. But the way that AMD has done this is just absolutely wrong towards their consumer base, and they're going to catch a lot of heat for it. And I think they're going to see a lot of people start to walk away and look for other options or just not update, right? That's the other thing, is they're just going to not update. They're going to wait to catch a 3600 on the cheap, or 38 or 3700 on the cheap after the 4000s come out, and that's going to be it. And they're just going to stay put. But if you were running a 2700X or a 2600 on a B450 or an X470, and you wanted to get to that 4000 series, you didn't want, you said, my performance is good enough. My performance is good enough, and I don't need the 3000 right now. I'm in a good place, and I'm just going to camp out. AMD said that the AM4 socket's good till 2020. It's fine. I'm going to wait for the 4000 series chip set out. Now you're just, you're left holding your junk in your hand because you got nowhere to go. And if you were an early adopter of Ryzen 3000, but you didn't have a bunch of money to sink into an X570 chipset, and you were like, hey, I'm digging this Ryzen 5 3600. I got a really good Black, Friday deal, or whatever it is. I got a good deal at Micro Center, but I just couldn't swing the X570 board. So I went ahead and got the B450 because I heard that's a good board. I got something like a nice MSI mortar titanium B450 or something like that. It's got a solid heatsink, good VRMs, and yeah, it's going to be fine. And then, later down the road, I can upgrade to a Ryzen 4000, no problem. Now you're just left holding your Johnson in your hand because AMD's like, no, sorry. I know we should have had the B550 out when you were doing your Black Friday shopping, but it's just not a thing. And you're just not going to be able to upgrade that motherboard. And that really sucks. And I feel like there is definitely a path for AMD to fix this. I don't buy the bullcrap about there not being enough space on the BIOS ROM and the EEPROM. Like I said, I got plenty of motherboards over here whose BIOS chips are half full, and they're running BIOSes that support all the way up to the Ryzen 3000. I got X370 motherboards that will support a 3000 series chip, and that BIOS chip has a 16 point something megabyte BIOS file on it on a 32 megabyte chip. So you tell me, is the new Ryzen 4000 series BIOS more than 32 megabytes? Here's a hint, it's not. So fix it, AMD. Just freaking fix it. That's all you got to do. And you will absolutely just crush Intel in every single segment for like at least a decade. You could set up so much supremacy right now in this particular market, right? You're already crushing Intel in the mobile solution, and Ryzen 3 is now competitive. And if you just unleash the ability of the interoperability of the AM4 platform, you will absolutely just come away with the win here. There's no two ways about it. And it blows my mind. It absolutely blows my mind that a company of this capability, with somebody like Dr. Lisa Su as the CEO, that they can't see this. It just feels cheap. It just feels cheap and greedy. And, it's not technical. There's not a technical reason for this. It just feels like cheap greed. And that's my rant for this Saturday evening, this late Saturday evening. This stuff is just keeping me awake at night. And I wanted to get it off my chest. I got my libation here because I need something to calm the nerves. So, yeah. What do you think? What do you think about, the timing of all of this? The Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300, consumer, bringing power to the people chips for gaming, 4 cores, 8 threads. You got some good overclock ability. You got great IPC on the Ryzen 3. But if you're an early adopter, if you buy one of those chips to replace maybe an original non-AF version Ryzen 5 1600, on your X370 motherboard or B350 motherboard even. If you've got one of those good B350 boards that's capable of supporting Zen 3, why can it not support Zen 2, Ryzen 3000? Why can't it support Ryzen 4000? Or if you bought a 3100 or a 3300X to go on your X370, would you be okay? You had to update your BIOS to get that chip on there. Would you be okay if you wanted to upgrade to, like, say, a Ryzen 5 4600 or a Ryzen 7 4700 a few years down the road? Would you be okay with flashing that BIOS so that it no longer supported the first-gen Ryzen chips? I know I would, to quote Will Ferrell as Harry Carey. I would do it in a heartbeat. I know I would. If I was running a 3100 or a 3300X on an X370 or a B450 or an X470, and my choice was, well, you can only upgrade to an older used Ryzen 3000 series chip a couple of years down the road, or you could probably buy a new old stock or, closeout series Ryzen 4000 series chip, but you can't. There'll be no backwards compatibility with the very, very first or maybe even second gen Ryzen. Are you willing to cut off your legacy CPU support in order for your motherboard to continue to support 4000 series AM4 socketed CPUs? And I think that's an easy decision for everybody. I don't know why AMD won't let the consumer make that decision. Let us make that decision. If we want to cut off, the legacy support in order to gain future support, let us do that. Let us and the motherboard manufacturers figure that out. Don't make that decision carte blanche. Don't take that power away from the consumer. We like your product. We want to continue to buy your product. That's what I don't understand you not understanding. We want to continue to buy your product. If I have an X370 motherboard or a B450 motherboard and I want more and more of your CPUs and your CPU power, let me get it. Let me get it. It's only going to, when my friends come over and they see my awesome Ryzen CPU, or if I'm online gaming and I'm just capping everybody because my frame rates are awesome, people are like, what CPU? What's your rig? What's your rig look like? And I'm like, oh, yeah, it's Ryzen, man. Yeah, I've got a 4000 series chip. I got it on this B450 board, and it's awesome. People are going to be like, that's cool. And when they figure out that, the B350 and B450 boards have been phased out, and the B550 is what's left, well, that's what they're going to buy. They're going to buy the B550. And oh, by the way, if you don't drop the B650 motherboard concurrent with Ryzen 4000, you're a joke. You're AMD, you're an absolute joke if you don't do that. You cannot just box the consumer in this way and expect us to just take it lying down and like not get some flack over it. It's just absolutely ludicrous. You need to figure it out. Don't withhold the consumer grade product, and then once the consumer grade product comes out, tell everybody that bought the previous consumer grade product, oh, well, you should have waited, I guess, because everything you bought in the interim is not compatible going forward. It just absolutely chaps my ass. I just do not like that at all. Like I said, if B550 had dropped when the Ryzen 5 3600 had dropped, a lot less of a conversation there. There's way less hate, way less ire. I kind of would understand if they said, "Hey, we've given you a year on the consumer level motherboards to get those out." I understand maybe it taken a while to get the 3100 and the 3300X out because they were really busy trying to go toe-to-toe with Intel on the high end. And I get that play, right? But the truncation of the timeline for AM4 support by this artificial break you're imposing, just smacks of greed and sliminess and foul play. And I think you're going to lose a lot. You're going to gain a lot of detractors and lose a lot of supporters because of the way you've handled this. Every Intel fanboy is going to look at this and say, ha ha, I told you so. I told you so. Even all the same, while Intel rolls out a Z490 board that only supports one generation of CPUs, they're still going to look over this and say, ha ha, Intel or AMD screwed you. All the Intel fanboys are going to hold their noses and point and be like, yeah, how's that feel? Now you know. There's no good guys in this game. AMD had the chance to be the good guy. And evidently they're proving the point that there are no good guys in this game. And on that disappointing bombshell, I am going to close. All right, rant over. I'll catch y'all on the next one.